So my name is Alex Pisha,
I'm Whitney Izor.
and we traveled to Germany to study landscapes of production. Germany has a long history of manipulating their limited landscape to meet the demands of production. In response to the needs of a highly dense population within the restricted spaces of Germany's varied and challenging terrain, efficient land management practices and effective environmental policies have emerged. While in Germany, we chose to study how the winemaking industry has responded to the varied terrain and climate, specifically how viticultural methods are defined by specific landscapes. We also explored how the landscape has been structured to optimize wine production within the specific regions, while also studying the effects of viticulture on nurturing local identity. So of the 13 wine-growing regions in Germany, we were able to visit and analyze 4. These included Rheinhessen, which is Germany's largest wine-growing region and the site of a prehistoric ocean, the Naha region, which is characterized by its volcanic geology, the Rheingau, where the river valley creates a sort of microclimate along its banks, and the Mosel, which is characterized by vineyards on extremely steep slopes. Each of these regions have very different climatic conditions, soil types, and landscapes. Additionally, each of the wineries we chose to visit and interview vary greatly from each other and offer a broad understanding of different techniques, philosophies, and approaches to winemaking in Germany. We're going to present each of the regions we visited. However, first we'd just like to give you some general information that we found applied to each of the landscapes that we studied, as well as the grape growing and winemaking process. So at least a dozen grape varieties were grown in the regions we visited, with the most common being the Riesling grape. Riesling is the dominant grape due to the shorter, cooler growing season and its preference for calcium-rich soils. The time that it takes the grapevine to mature and produce berries that could be used for wine is approximately 4 years. It takes about 3 years for it to mature. The third year it'll produce berries, but they're not of a quality that you'd be using for wine. So by the 4th year, you could actually start wine production. Additionally, grapes have a very long taproot system that can grow 50 feet deep in order to reach water, and in some places like Italy and Spain, it grows quite a lot deeper. The amount of space needed to grow grapes is not as expansive as we had initially assumed, with both of us having backgrounds in the Midwest and being familiar with the large-scale farming techniques found here. We were surprised to learn that a large vineyard is about 3 hectares or 7.4 acres, and a small vineyard is about 1,200 square meters or about a third of an acre. In terms of yield, a large vineyard, again, one that's about 3 hectares, can produce 31,500 liters of wine on average. And this is compared to the higher quality wines, which at the same size vineyard will produce approximately 15,000 liters of wine due primarily to selective harvesting. In regards to quality, there's many factors that can determine the quality of a grape and subsequently the wine produced from that grape. These factors include site orientation, levels of rainfall, and most importantly, soil composition. Orientation of the vineyard is extremely important. North-facing vineyards produce grapes that are of poor quality versus south-facing vineyards, which produce the high-quality grapes and are therefore preferred sites. This is, of course, in relationship to levels of sunlight the vines receive. If there's too much sunlight, then the grape will produce too much sugar. If there's too little sunlight, then not enough sugar is produced, which has a negative effect on the fermentation process. Rainfall is also important in creating a quality wine. Too little and the grape will grow in tight, small clusters and produce a highly concentrated juice. If there's too much rain, then the grape will produce too much juice and will water down the taste. Additionally, too much rain can lead to a variety of fungal issues. For example, in 2010, the Naha region received about 40 liters of rainfall per square meter. This caused the grapes to produce too much juice, which led to the skin on the berries cracking and opening and allowed for fungus to enter, severely damaging their harvest that year. And finally, the soil composition is probably the most important element in predicting the quality of the grape grown and the wine that will be produced. The top layer of the soil in these regions is one that has high calcium content, and as the grapevine grows and the roots grow deeper, the roots move into a new horizon with different mineral compositions. And it takes approximately 7 to 10 years for the roots to get through that calcium layer until reaching what is considered the most desirable horizon layer, which is composed primarily of slate. Each of these minerals alters the taste of the grape and the wine, and those wines that are considered to be of a higher quality or desirable typically have a high mineral content. And it's these minerals that we notice when describing wines. So for example, if you taste a wine and you can describe it as having crispness or an acidic quality of it, you're tasting the calcium mineral in it, and so you know that it's a relatively young vine that the wine came from. Okay, so speaking to our first region we visited Michel-Fannebecker, located in the Rheinhessen region of Germany. Again, this is Germany's largest wine-growing region, due in large part to their climate, which is the driest and warmest in Germany, with an average temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit. which lends itself well to growing grapes. This allows the region to experience an earlier harvest season than the other regions. The harvest season in Rheinhessen ends in late September, and that's when most other regions are just beginning their harvest season. The landscape of this region is generally flat to gently rolling hills, and 30 to 60 million years ago, this region was covered by an ocean. When it receded, the limestone was left behind, and the fossilized snails and mussels are commonly found through the vineyards. The first vintner we spoke with was Georg Vannebekke, whose family has been making wine since 1677, and whose winery, Weingut Michael Vannebekke, is one of the most award-winning wineries in Europe. His winery grows 10 to 12 grape varieties, including Riesling, Sylvaner, Spätburgunder, which is Pinot Noir, Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, and Chardonnay. He was able to explain to us the importance of the soil composition in determining what type of grape to grow, using soil and geology maps to help decide what grapes should be grown. He also discussed a little of the history of wine growing in Germany and Europe. Of particular interest was that due to an insect called the Reblaus, or grape phylloxera, which eats the root system of grapes and had at one point almost completely destroyed the wine industry in Europe, it is illegal in Germany and most of Europe to use a European grape root system. Instead, the American grape, Vitis sylvestris, which is immune to the Reblaus, is used for the root stock and is grafted to a European grape, which produces the fruit. He also discussed a topic which, although he had researched it earlier, we found it very difficult to understand initially, and that's the Flurbereinigungssystem, which Whitney had a great time trying to pronounce. The Flurbereinigung is essentially a way to organize and economize the landscape. Initially conceived in the 1920s but not realized until recently, the Flurbereinigung has led to a more efficient use of productive landscapes. Prior to its introduction, all farmland was owned by the church or private individuals and was constantly being subdivided due to inheritance laws. This resulted in parcels that were not adjacent to each other, inefficient triangular plots, and an overabundance of roadways that would divide the landscape and use what could have been productive land. To counter this, a massive effort to reorganize and assign the landscape was undertaken. Each region's productive land was grouped together, divided into a grid, and then reassigned to the farmers. This would mean that land that had once belonged to a family for centuries was now available to be given to a new family. The land is periodically reassigned so that, for example, land that has ideal soil conditions is not permanently in the same family. The land is ranked based on sun orientation and soil quality and then evenly distributed so that everyone receives land that is both highly desirable and land that is less desirable. So it's a sort of a fair arrangement. Of course, this is highly controversial, with many of the landowners trying to fight it, while the tenant farmers, who are the majority in Germany, embraced it. As incentive, the government offered to partially subsidize the construction of new infrastructure, including access roads, irrigation systems, topography changes, drainage dishes, erosion control methods, etc. An additional feature of the Flurbereinigungssystem is the protection of environment and species habitat. For example, part of Mr. Vannebekker's vineyard is considered a bird sanctuary for the northern wheat ear, which is an endangered species and has traditionally used the dry stack limestone retaining walls as its nesting area. So if for any reason the walls have to be removed, the vintner has to rebuild the walls elsewhere within his property, and this is an example of the newer construction.
So I'll speak a little bit as to the general nature of the Rheinhessen region. Again, this is the largest wine growing region, and although each family has their own parcel of land, it really starts to read as a collective landscape in the way in which people use it. So this gives you a general view of, again, the vines were historically grown on places where you couldn't have crops for food, and so really they tend to be on slopes and less desirable land. So you can see in the foreground vineyards on the hill, and in the distance towns are always nestled in the valleys in this region, and you see the cropland beyond. So because the town, as you saw in the valley here, people live in the town and their parcels are outside of the town, and so you see in this landscape a series of these small pavilions where they stop to rest during the day or during harsh weather. And so you can see a series of these here that sort of dot the landscape. And also, even though this is privately owned land, you'll see, for example, here, a lot of now paved trails that wind their way through the vineyards, and these are kind of a public park of sorts. You always see people out biking and walking. It'd be impossible to be out there without running into someone. Again, just a general view of the vines. You can see from these are sort of older growth vines. You can tell by the stalk. And because of the Flurbereinigung and the reconsolidation of the parcels, there's also a lot of new planting going on. So you'll see a lot of new vines going in. They protect from pests in this way. Very simple, gentle methods, I guess, to control pests. Again, this is an example of one of the trails that divides the vineyards. You see people out walking on these. Also, what was interesting to us is, here in the Midwest, we have a lot of monoculture in our agriculture. And so here, even though the majority of what we're walking through are either vines for grapes or grains, there's a lot of plant diversity here. They don't use pesticides or herbicides on a large scale at all. And this is just a large part of sort of cultural values, but also government as well. They have the Green Party is growing there. There are a lot of state-owned vineyards as well, so you see a lot of diversity in the landscape. These are just a few examples of what you see around. Also, on the right here, cover crops that you see in between the rows are quite diverse. They plant these, sometimes alternating herbs in one row and grasses and clovers in the in-betweens. There's just a few examples. You see grape leaves on the left. These are in the upper right, some examples of wildflowers and herbs, and then also grains growing in the fields. I mentioned that they don't really use pesticides and herbicides very often. This little plastic gadget you see on the left is what they call a pheromone trap. They maybe put 500 of these per hectare, and essentially it emits a pheromone that confuses certain species of male insects, and this keeps the population under control. And the pests that they do have on the right here, you see some galls. They do get some forms of leaf mites, but they don't really affect the berry themselves, so they just tolerate this. It doesn't create a lot of crop loss, so they just sort of absorb that rather than spraying.
So the next winery we chose is Weingut Wittmann, and they are located in the same region as Michel Fannebecker. However, they differ in that Wittmann is a biodynamic winery, something which is a growing trend in Germany. In order to be considered a biodynamic winery, you have to first become an organic winery, which takes approximately 6 years. After that, you can apply to become a biodynamic winery, and this takes, again, approximately 6 years. This means that all aspects of the winery have to be using eco-friendly methods, and they look to nature to help measure certain cycles. So, for example, no machines are allowed in the fields, no herbicides, pesticides, fertilizer, etc. can be used. Instead, they use herbs like mint to deter insects, and these are planted in between the rows as cover crops. Any waste that is produced has to be recycled in some way, so Wittmann uses the grape skins after the grapes are pressed to feed their livestock and the stems and leaves as mulch. The barrels that they buy come from coopers who use only wood from responsibly harvested forests, and finally they study moon phases to inform when they should plant and harvest, which also kind of threw us for a loop. So we next traveled to the Naha region, where we met with head vintner Oliver Müller from winery Wagner Stempel. This region is characterized by a landscape of rocky outcroppings and an undulating topography due to being a series of extinct volcanoes. As such, the soil is comprised of a variety of porphyry rocks and is very acidic. The winery was selected for this region is unique in that they have a variety of parcels that each have a different geology. For example, some parcels have very shallow soils reaching only 10 to 30 centimeters and very little can grow on it, while other areas, which they call the Golden Horn due to its being the area's highest point and south-facing orientation, grow some of the world's most prized vines. The area was in fact designated for the production of grapes due to its inhospitability towards any other type of farming, including livestock farming. We were especially interested in how a vineyard is organized and what steps are taken to prevent erosion, nutrient loss, and the challenges of growing grapes. In Germany, the row spacing is in relationship to the machinery. However, this is different in other European countries. For example, we learned in France the row spacing is considered part of the traditional technique, and as such, machinery was designed to fit that space. Between the rows, they plant cover crops of primarily grapes, which gets planted in winter, plowed under in spring, and that adds nutrients to the soil as well as aerates the soil. Native grasses and wildflowers are allowed to grow between the rows during the summer, and this also helps prevent erosion control. The vines planted along the more hilly portion of the vineyards do follow the contours, and this also helps prevent erosion. And due to this region's climate, they do have a shorter growing season, and getting fully ripe grapes is a challenge. Normally you would prune the tops of the grapes, however, removing about a quarter of the vine leaves so as to prevent overproduction of sugars. However, here they do not prune the vines so as to get optimal sun exposure. The only exception to this is the Pinot Noir grapes, which they plant on the higher and windier parcels to allow for greater air circulation, as this type of grape is prone to fungal infections. And here you can see they actually use roses as an indicator plant. The rose, if there is any sort of fungus or disease in the soil environment, the rose will will show the problems with that before it can affect the grapevine. So if there is an issue, they can address it right away. Again, these are some of the geology maps that he showed us, some of the historic wine maps of the region, and again, the parcels within that, with each one saying what type of grape is grown and things like that in the soil condition.
Can we talk about machinery?
Okay. The next region we studied was the Rheingau, or the Rhine River Valley, and this is potentially the more known region due to the high levels of production and export. Many of the German wines you would find in grocery stores in the U.S. come from either this region or the Moselle region. The landscape is characterized by hills, which gently slope and follow the curves of the River Rhine. This area is unique in that the river valley creates a sort of microclimate where the temperatures remain slightly warmer and the sunlight reflects off of the river, which benefits the vines. The winery we visited close to Eberbach is a great example of where old environments meet new techniques. The winery is Germany's largest, with a vineyard that is over 500 acres large and produces over 2.2 million bottles of wine annually. The winery is also one of Germany's oldest, being founded in 1136 by monks who also maintained a walled vineyard, which exists today and is where the winery's prized vines are grown. These walls were not only built for the protection, but also allow for vines to be espaliered, which lets the grapes ripen earlier due to the wall's retention of heat. Mm-hmm.
There's an example of the espalier grapes on the left, more of the historic method, but they still do grow grapes this way, the higher quality ones.
And this winery is also unique in that it is owned and operated by the government, specifically the German state of Hesse, which probably also explains why that state has one of the world's largest wine cellars. And so this is talking to a little bit about the sort of modernization of it. This vineyard is actually built on top of their manufacturing plant, that this is the roof of that facility. And they're really interested in using gravity as part of the process to process the grapes and turn them into wine. This is their contemporary wine cellar. And then their facility.
So essentially the building itself mimics the process of making the grapes. So you see here this glass lift, this is where they bring in the grapes in crates. They put this on the lift and they take it downstairs. There are these series of slits in the vineyard to allow light downstairs. So the grapes go down the lift and into the beginning stages of being pressed.
Mm-hmm. So these are the pneumatic bladder presses. It takes a long time because they don't want to press it too quickly, otherwise it'll bruise the grape and cause an overproduction of sugar. And then they move into the settlement tanks where any sort of stems and things like that are removed. And then they move into the stainless steel fermentation tanks and stay there for about 3 to 4 months before being bottled. And then this is their bottling and labeling facility, so it was quite modern compared to some of the other wineries we had visited. And then the storage. It's essentially the IKEA of wine at the end.
These are just a few quick examples, discussing with them issues of erosion on the slopes that they have. And for some reason, they don't have cover crops here, and they're dealing with issues of, again, drainage and erosion. You can start to see the silt building up in these ditches. So we see a lot of contradictory practices based on what they're saying versus what you see.
Well, the final region we studied was the Moselle. This region offers one of the most dramatic landscapes we experienced through our study and is characterized by extremely steep hillsides which follow the curves of the River Moselle. The winery we visited, the Calmont, is Europe's steepest winery with a slope of 65 degrees that rises approximately 300 meters or almost 1,000 feet above the river. The vineyard is a series of terraces defined by slate retaining walls, and there are no roads that cut through the vineyard, only narrow, winding footpaths. The incline is so steep that machines cannot be used, and therefore all work has to be done by hand. And to help transport the grapes down the hill, a series of small one-person trains were built, and these are some of the tracks for those trains that you can see. The site is very labor-intensive, but it also is one of the best conditions for growing grapes. The vineyard is protected against cold northerly winds, and the optimal inclination of the hill allows for maximum sun exposure. Additionally, the high percentage of rocks in the soil absorb the sun's heat and release it back into the soil, allowing the vine's root systems to thrive. So again, these are some of those train systems that cut through the vineyard. and you can see the composition of slate in the soil.
Unlike some of the cover crops with the clover and herbs and things that you saw on the more rolling hills, the land here is really unstable, and so you see a lot more of these viney or mossy type plants.
So in conclusion, this grant really allowed us to study a landscape that is not only blending historic and contemporary systems to manage and create a productive landscape, but it also allowed us to experience a landscape that, although is about half the size of Ohio, is extremely diverse. Additionally, one of the many common threads that we experienced was just how passionate each region is about the wine that they produce. Each vintner we met with was genuinely excited to talk to us, tell us about their winery, tell us their history of the region, and show us just how passionate they are about what they produce. We were given the opportunity to not only understand how a series of systems can compose a landscape, but also glimpse the richness of the culture that is consistently focused on strengthening their productive landscapes. And it is through this lens that we have become better able to understand what it means to be a landscape of production and its effects environmentally, socially, and culturally. All right.
Any questions?